Everyone wants to tell you the 1960s was the golden age of American muscle, and they're right. But here's what nobody wants to admit. For every legend that rolled off the line and into history, there was something else rolling off right behind it. Something slower, stranger, and more embarrassing than Detroit would ever care to confess. Today we're counting down the 7 worst and 6 best muscle cars of the 1960s. The machines that defined an era and the ones that nearly destroyed it before it even got started. The 7 worst. Number 7. The 1966 AMC Rambler Marlin. A car that had no idea what it wanted to be when it grew up. American Motors Corporation was always the scrappy underdog of the muscle car wars, working with a fraction of the budget that General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler threw around like pocket change. Sometimes that produced genuinely interesting results, and sometimes it produced the Rambler Marlin. The concept started life as the Tarpon, a clean, compact fastback coupe that actually looked pretty sharp. Then somebody at AMC decided to stretch it onto the larger classic platform to give rear seat passengers more headroom. What they got instead was a car that looked like 2 completely different vehicles had been welded together in the dark. The front end was fine. The rear end looked like it belonged to a different car entirely, from a different company, possibly from a different planet. Now add a 327 cubic inch V8 making 270 horsepower, and you have a muscle car that weighed too much, handled like a houseboat in choppy water, and couldn't scare a Pontiac Tempest on its best day. The narrow track width combined with that long, heavy body meant body roll in corners was genuinely alarming. Drivers gripped the steering wheel, not out of excitement, but out of self-preservation. AMC sold 10,327 Marlins in 1966. By 1967, that number collapsed to 2,545. By 1968, mercifully, it was gone. Look, AMC deserves credit for trying. They just should have stopped trying with this particular car. Number 6. The 1962 Dodge Dart. Here is a car born from pure corporate panic. Chrysler executives heard rumors that General Motors was planning to downsize their full-size cars. So they ordered Dodge to shrink the Dart at the last minute. The rumors turned out to be wrong. GM did not shrink their full-size cars. But the damage was already done, and the 1962 Dodge Dart arrived in showrooms looking confused, proportionally awkward, and utterly unloved. It wasn't quite full-size. It wasn't quite mid-size. It existed in a strange automotive limbo that buyers rejected immediately. Sales fell from 307,000 units in 1960 to just 110,000 in 1962. That is not a decline. That is a collapse. To be fair, Dodge did offer the Max Wedge V8, a 413 cubic inch monster with twin 4-barrel carburetors and headers that looked like something NASA rejected. On a drag strip with the right rear axle ratio, the Max Wedge Dart was genuinely terrifying. But here's the problem. That engine was so extreme, so utterly unsuited to everyday driving, that it appealed to maybe 3% of buyers. Everybody else looked at the awkward body, the push-button automatic transmission, and the uninspired styling, and quietly walked across the street to the Pontiac dealership. The 1962 Dart was fixed the following year, but that first year stands as a monument to what happens when boardroom decisions override engineering common sense. Number 5. The 1965 Plymouth Barracuda. Plymouth looked at the Ford Mustang selling 400,000 units in its first year and thought, we can do that. We can absolutely do that. Ford isn't that clever. We have engineers, we have factories, we have ambition. What could possibly go wrong? What they built was the 1965 Barracuda, and what they actually delivered was a Valiant with a massive curved rear window glued to the back of it. That's not entirely fair, but it's not entirely wrong either. The story of how the Barracuda came to exist is almost painful in hindsight. Plymouth had a compact platform already in production, the Valiant. And rather than develop something genuinely new from the ground up the way Ford had done with the Mustang, they decided to work with what they had. The result was a car built on economy car bones, wearing a dramatic wraparound fastback rear window that was genuinely distinctive and genuinely enormous, spanning nearly the entire roofline in a single piece of curved glass. It was striking. It was different. It was also not a hatchback, which meant the cargo space behind that dramatic window was awkward and underutilized. The window was the show, and there was nothing behind it worth watching. The fundamental problem ran deeper than the glasswork, though. The Barracuda simply didn't know what it was supposed to be. A sports car? A pony car? A practical compact with sporty pretensions? Plymouth never answered that question clearly, and buyers noticed immediately. The base six-cylinder engine had absolutely no business appearing in a car being marketed against the Mustang. None. It was an economy car engine in a performance costume, and it convinced nobody. Even the top V8 option, a 273 cubic inch unit producing 180 horsepower, struggled to generate genuine excitement in a market where the Mustang was already offering 271 horsepower and doing it with considerably more swagger. 0 to 60 in base form took nearly 13 seconds. 13 seconds. There were station wagons that could keep pace. The suspension came directly from the Valiant because it was the Valiant underneath, and it drove exactly like one, perfectly competently, completely without drama, which is precisely the opposite of what people lining up at Mustang dealerships were looking for. Plymouth sold around 65,000 Barracudas that first year. The Mustang moved 400,000. The public had spoken, loudly, clearly, and without much sympathy. The Barracuda would eventually grow into something genuinely fearsome. The 1970 Hemi Cuda is one of the most desirable muscle cars ever built, and nobody argues otherwise. But the 1965 original remains one of the great missed opportunities of the decade. All that potential, all that ambition, and what they launched with was essentially a Valiant wearing a very large hat. Number 4. The 1964 Mercury Comet Cyclone. The Cyclone had a great name. That's probably the nicest thing that can be said about the 1964 version. Mercury dressed it up with a dual-scoop fiberglass hood that was entirely decorative, chrome trim, that added weight without adding anything else, and Cyclone badges with little racing flags that were doing a lot of heavy lifting in the credibility department. Under all that visual noise sat a 289 cubic inch V8 making 271 horsepower, which on paper sounds competitive, until you remember it was sitting in a compact platform with a narrow track width that made handling genuinely unpredictable. Corners were not this car's friend. Bumps in the road telegraphed directly through the chassis into your spine. The 4-speed manual transmission was clunky and unrewarding to operate. And then there was the fuel consumption. The Cyclone drank gasoline with a dedication that bordered on impressive. You weren't driving it so much as supervising an expensive liquid disappearing act. Mercury was trying to build a muscle car image on a compact economy platform, and it showed in every mile driven. The Cyclone name would get better in later years, particularly by 1968 and 1969, when the car grew up properly and started backing up its aggressive appearance with real performance. But the early version was proof that slapping scoops on something doesn't make it fast. Number 3. The 1969 Ford Torino Talladega. Now, here's where things get complicated, because the Torino Talladega is on this worst list for a very specific reason, and it has nothing to do with what it was designed to do. As a NASCAR homologation special built to win on the super speedways, the Talladega was a genuine engineering achievement. That extended nose, the flush-mounted grille, the reshaped roofline, all of it worked exactly as intended. Buddy Baker ran one at speeds that made NASCAR officials deeply uncomfortable, but Ford had to sell street versions to qualify for racing, and that's where the problems began. The street Talladega came with the 428 cubic inch Cobra jet, officially rated at 335 horsepower, which was respectable, but it was paired exclusively with an automatic transmission. Column shifted, on a car that looked like it had driven straight off a racetrack. No manual option, none. Imagine ordering the most aggressive-looking car on the lot and discovering it shifts gears by itself, like your grandmother's Oldsmobile. The interior was stripped and basic because Ford was focused on aerodynamics, not amenities. The ride was stiff because the suspension was tuned for high-speed oval stability, not the everyday roads that actual buyers drove on. The elongated nose made parking a genuine adventure, and Ford only built somewhere around 754 of them. Not because demand was overwhelming, but because that's all they needed for homologation. The Talladega was a brilliant race car wearing street clothes that didn't quite fit. If you wanted a race car, it was extraordinary. If you wanted a muscle car you could actually enjoy on Tuesday morning, you bought something else. Number 2. The 1966 Chevrolet Chevelle SS 396. Hold on before you come for me in the comments. Yes, the Chevelle SS 396 is an icon. Yes, it's beautiful. Yes, the name alone makes grown men emotional, but the 1966 base version had a problem that the mythology tends to gloss over, and that problem was the base engine. The entry-level SS 396 came with a 325 horsepower version of the big block, in a car that tipped the scales at over 3,700 pounds. That was not enough. Not even close. You were paying for the SS badge and getting Chevelle-sized performance wrapped in Chevelle-sized weight. Lighter, cheaper cars were regularly pulling away from base SS 396s at stoplights across America, which had to be a deeply humbling experience. The suspension was tuned for straight-line stability, and it was genuinely soft, which meant corners were a negotiation rather than a commitment. The steering communicated very little about what the front tires were actually doing, which is a polite way of saying you sometimes found out you'd pushed too hard after the fact rather than before. To be absolutely clear, when buyers specified the 360 horsepower L34 or the 375 horsepower L78 options, the Chevelle SS became a completely different animal, a genuinely terrifying one. But the base car, the car most people actually bought, was trading heavily on reputation. It looked the part far better than it played it. The lesson here is that 325 horsepower in a heavy body is not a muscle car. It's a muscle car costume. Number 1. The 1969 Dodge Charger Daytona. The street version? Before Mopar enthusiasts disconnect entirely, let me explain. Because this might be the most fascinating worst car in automotive history. The Charger Daytona on the racing circuit was one of the most dominant machines ever built. Buddy Baker cracked 200 miles per hour at Talladega. The aerodynamic nose cone and that towering rear wing weren't styling exercises. They were engineering solutions that rewrote what was possible on an oval track. And then Dodge had to sell 503 of them to the public to meet homologation requirements. And that's where things got weird. That nose cone added nearly 2 feet to the car's length. Try parallel parking that outside a diner. The pop-up headlights were buried inside the extended front end, which sounded exotic until one of them stopped working and you discovered what the repair bill looked like. The rear wing stood so tall that some parking garages simply wouldn't accommodate it. Several dealerships reportedly removed the wings and nose cones just to move inventory, which today represents one of the great automotive crimes of the 20th century, given what those unmodified cars are worth. The street engine options, either the 440 Magnum or the 426 Hemi, were genuinely powerful. Nobody is arguing that, but the car was tuned for sustained high-speed oval running, not the stop-and-go reality of American streets in 1969. It was heavy, it was stiff, and it was shaped for one specific purpose that most buyers would never get to experience. Dodge built the Daytona to win races. It did that brilliantly. What they built for the street was essentially a race car that had been handed a driver's license and told to figure it out. Some cars are simply too single-minded for the real world. The Daytona was the most spectacular example of that truth in the entire decade. The 6th best number 6, the 1964 Pontiac GTO. Everything has to start somewhere, and the muscle car era started right here in 1964 with a loophole and a legend. General Motors had a corporate rule that prohibited engines larger than 330 cubic inches in mid-size cars. Most engineers shrugged and lived with it. John DeLorean looked at that rule, found a gap big enough to drive a muscle car through, and packaged the GTO as an option on the Tempest rather than a standalone model. Technically, it wasn't a new car. It was just a very enthusiastic checkbox on an order form. Nobody at General Motors could stop him, and American automotive history was never the same again. What buyers got when they checked that box was a 389 cubic inch V8 producing 325 horsepower in standard form, or 348 with the optional tri-power carburetor setup. They got aggressive styling that announced its intentions from a block away. And they got a price that put genuine, tire-shredding, stoplight-dominating performance within reach of anyone with a steady job and a reasonable credit score. Pontiac expected to sell 5,000 units. They sold over 32,000. Dealers couldn't keep them on the lot. Every other manufacturer immediately began scrambling to build their own answer to what Pontiac had just done. Without the 1964 GTO, there is no Chevelle SS, no Roadrunner, no Charger, no muscle car golden age, no list like this one. It started everything, 0 to 60 in 6.5 seconds, quarter mile in the low 15s. In a car, an ordinary American could actually finance. That combination had simply never existed before. The GTO didn't just open the door to the muscle car era. It kicked it clean off the hinges and never looked back. Number 5. The 1968 Oldsmobile 442 W30. Oldsmobile never got the respect they deserved in the muscle car conversation. Too sophisticated, people said, not flashy enough, which was exactly the point. The 442 W30 was a muscle car built by engineers who understood that power without control was just an accident waiting to happen. The 400 cubic inch V8 with cold air induction pulled intake temperatures down and pushed real-world output well beyond what the factory ever officially acknowledged. 0 to 60 in 6.1 seconds. The quarter mile in 14.3 at 98 miles per hour. But the chassis work was what separated the W30 from the competition. Heavy-duty suspension, front and rear. Upgraded brakes. Steering that actually communicated with the driver. This was a muscle car that could handle corners. In 1968, that was practically a revolutionary concept. Only around 4,000 were built, which makes them rare and underappreciated in equal measure. Anyone who ever drove a W30 and understood what they were sitting in never forgot it. Number 4. The 1967 Shelby GT 500. Carroll Shelby looked at what Ford had built with the standard Mustang and came to a conclusion that most polite people would have kept to themselves. It needed a considerable amount of additional attitude, so he got to work. Out went the standard engine. In went a 428 cubic inch Cobra Le Mans V8, the same basic architecture that had helped Ford humiliate Ferrari at Le Mans in 1966. Shelby reworked the suspension for actual stability at actual speeds, not just the speeds Ford's engineers had imagined during testing. He reshaped the nose, added a rear spoiler, and revised the styling until the whole car communicated one clear message before you even turned the key. Officially, the GT500 made 400 horsepower. In reality, depending on the specific car and how honestly it had been tuned, the number was often considerably higher. A properly sorted example could run the quarter mile in 13.6 seconds at 106 miles per hour. For a street-legal American car in 1967, that was a genuinely alarming number. But here's what separated the GT500 from being merely fast. It was finished. The earlier GT350 was a brilliant car with rough edges sharp enough to draw blood. The GT500 smoothed those edges without softening the personality. The power delivery was there. The high-speed stability was there. The suspension actually worked in concert with the engine instead of fighting it. The whole package had a cohesion that made it feel like one complete idea rather than several good ideas arguing with each other. It looked dangerous. It sounded dangerous. And unlike a few of the cars on the worst side of this list, it absolutely delivered on every single promise its appearance made. Intentionally, controllably, magnificently dangerous. Number 3. The 1967 Chevrolet Corvette L88. Only about 220 of these were ever built. The L88 option on the 1967 Corvette was Chevrolet's most powerful production engine, a 427 cubic inch monster officially rated at 430 horsepower. Officially. Everyone who worked on one or raced one understood that number was a conservative piece of fiction, designed to keep insurance companies and federal regulators from asking too many uncomfortable questions. Real-world output was closer to 500 horses. The compression ratio was 11:1, which meant it demanded premium fuel and careful tuning, and rewarded anyone who gave it both with performance that embarrassed nearly everything else on American roads. 0 to 60, around 5.5 seconds. quarter miles in the low 13s. Top speed passed 140 miles per hour on a car wearing road tires and a license plate. The L88 was a race engine that had been persuaded, barely, to put on street clothes. It idled roughly. It ran hot in traffic. It required commitment and knowledge from its driver. What it gave back to those who understood it was an experience that set the absolute standard for what American performance could be. Today, these cars approach or exceed $500,000. They were worth every single penny then, and they are worth every single penny now. Number 2. The 1969 Ford Mustang Boss 429. Ford built the Boss 429 to homologate an engine for NASCAR. What they accidentally built in the process was one of the most exotic and purposeful street machines of the entire decade. The 429 cubic inch semi, Hemi V8, featured canted valve heads that breathe better than anything else Ford had ever put in a production car. The official rating was 375 horsepower. The actual number was closer to 500, possibly more, depending on which dyno you believe and how honest the person running it was feeling that day. Ford had to physically cut and reinforce the Mustang shock towers to make the engine fit, then relocated the battery to the trunk for weight distribution. Every single car was hand-built by CarCraft in Brighton, Michigan. Only 859 were produced in 1969, not because demand was low, but because the process of building each one was so involved that making more wasn't practical. On the drag strip, bone stock Boss 429s were running low 13-second quarter miles before most owners had even broken them in properly. Insurance companies either refused to write policies on them or charge premiums that were higher than the monthly payment. This was a race car with turn signals, and it remains one of the greatest muscle cars ever built because it never pretended to be anything else. Number 1. The 1969 Chevrolet Camaro ZL1. At the very top of the best list sits something that barely existed, something Chevrolet never advertised, never promoted, and sold only to buyers who already knew the secret before they walked through the door. The ZL1 Camaro carried an all-aluminum 427 cubic inch big block that the factory officially rated at 430 horsepower. If you believe that number, I have some beachfront property in Kansas I'd like to discuss with you. Independent testing put real output north of 550 horses. Some estimates touch 600 with proper tuning. The aluminum block saved nearly 100 pounds compared to the iron version, which shifted the weight distribution forward and gave the Camaro a balance and responsiveness that the heavier engine simply couldn't have provided. On the drag strip, ZL1s were running quarter miles in the low 12s at over 115 miles per hour. Stock. From the factory with a warranty. 69 of them were ever built. 69. Each one cost over $7,500 in 1969, which was more than 2 standard Corvettes. Insurance companies refused coverage for young buyers. Dealers were reluctant to stock them because they couldn't move a car that expensive. Most of the ones that left showrooms went directly to serious racers who understood exactly what they had. The National Hot Rod Association took one look at the ZL1's performance numbers and immediately reclassified it into higher competition brackets, effectively banning it from racing against standard Camaros. When a sanctioning body bans your car from its own class because it's simply too fast to be fair, you have built something special. The ZL1 wasn't a muscle car you bought to look cool or impress people at a cruise night, though it would have done both effortlessly. It was a statement about what was possible when engineers stopped asking whether something was practical and started asking how fast they could make it go. It was Chevrolet's dirty secret, their most extreme creation, and the single greatest expression of 1960s muscle car madness ever to receive a license plate. Today, a ZL1 Camaro can fetch over $1 million at auction, which means it is appreciated at a rate that would make most financial advisors quietly envious. The 1960s gave us the best and worst of American automotive ambition all at once. It gave us cars that defined what performance meant, and cars that demonstrated what happened when ego outran engineering. The legends earned their status. The disasters earned their place in history too, because without the failures, you don't fully appreciate what the triumphs actually cost.